When the First World War began, everything was set to change, and the cigarette was no exception. Before 1914, the cigarette was seen as the vice of the underclass, associated with criminals, foreigners, outcasts, and rogues. It was regarded as harmful to the health of the average American and a warning sign of societal collapse. But by the time the war ended 4 years later, the cigarette's popularity had skyrocketed. Its smoker was no longer seen as a pariah, but a patriot. How did this transformation happen? How did the cigarette rise from obscurity to global dominance? The answer lies in war. It's the story of how the world's militaries briefly became the largest cartels, addicting millions of soldiers and sending them home to spread the habit. It's also a tale of how advertisers took advantage of this fact and how the United States sold the cigarette to a world scarred by conflict. This is the story of how war built the cigarette. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, society wasn't particularly fond of cigarettes. They were a curious novelty that most people didn't fully understand. And in the shadows of ignorance, fear and prejudice took root. In Great Britain, cigarettes were linked to a lack of manliness and seen as effeminate. In the United States, they were associated with immoral troublemakers, criminals, or foreigners whose customs were so unfamiliar they might as well have been from another world. As far as the American middle class was concerned, reflecting this sentiment, a particularly alarmist 1886 New York Times article claimed that Spain's decline began when its people adopted cigarettes. It warned that if this pernicious practice spread among adult Americans, the downfall of the Republic would be close at hand. Influential Americans like Henry Ford also railed against cigarettes. In a 1914 pamphlet, Ford made his case against them. Early health reformers criticized cigarettes as unhealthy and feared they would weaken an entire generation of young Americans who were disproportionately seen smoking them. Temperance activists equated cigarette addiction with alcohol abuse and its destructive side effects, creating an unfortunate association with a product that, like alcohol, would soon be banned under prohibition. Yet cigarettes never faced the same fate. Between 1895 and 1921, 15 states banned cigarette sales, but those bans were short-lived. By 1927, all the bans had been repealed. In fact, despite strong opposition, per capita cigarette consumption increased by more than 1,000% between 1900 and 1920. The battle against cigarettes never reached the intensity of the fight against alcohol because another conflict interrupted it: the First World War. The war triggered a massive increase in cigarette consumption in nearly all participating nations. In the UK, cigarette consumption nearly doubled between 1914 and 1920, becoming the dominant form of tobacco use. In France, cigarette sales jumped from 3.7 to 4.9 billion between 1913 and 1919, a 31% increase. In Germany, cigarette production rose from 13 billion in 1914 to 30.5 billion by 1925. The United States was no different, with per capita consumption more than doubling between 1915 and 1920, and some estimates suggesting it tripled. One major reason for this surge was the widespread use of cigarettes among soldiers. Cigarettes were included in the rations of US, British, French, and German soldiers to boost morale in the trenches. It was quickly recognized that nicotine in cigarettes could calm soldiers' nerves, offering a rare comfort in the constant presence of chaos and catastrophe. For many, the cigarette became a tiny lifeline in the madness, a small white and brown soldier standing in formation in its own trench-like box, providing brief relief from the horrors of war. In this way, militaries became drug dealers, addicting their soldiers to cigarettes in an effort to keep spirits up. The significance the U.S. Army placed on smoking was evident in General John Pershing's remark, "You ask me what we need to win this war. I answer, tobacco as much as bullets. Tobacco is as indispensable as the daily ration." But what do you think? Do you find it surprising that cigarettes were so heavily relied on during wartime? Or maybe you have a different perspective on how the cigarette became so popular. Let us know in the comments whether it's your thoughts on the role of cigarettes in the war or a personal reflection on how smoking has impacted your life or the lives of those around you. We'd love to hear from you and start a conversation. The British Food Minister, David Thomas, also spoke highly of cigarettes. He pointed out that cigarettes were the most efficient way to deliver tobacco and nicotine. Their small, portable size made them the practical choice over cigars or pipes when logistics were considered. These qualities, along with the psychological and physical benefits believed to be gained from smoking during wartime, made cigarettes an incredibly popular product. Even temperance activists who had opposed cigarettes before the war suddenly changed their stance. The Young Men's Christian Association (EMCA), once a staunch opponent of smoking, its founder even calling cigarettes a growing evil, began distributing them to soldiers on the front lines and in military canteens. What caused this change of heart? Cigarettes were seen as a lesser evil compared to alcohol, prostitution, hard drugs, and gambling. The EMCA reasoned that cigarettes might help keep soldiers away from these more dangerous vices. As for concerns about health, denying soldiers cigarettes on health grounds seemed absurd when they were facing daily threats of shell fire and shrapnel on the front lines. One YMCA member captured the absurdity of the situation in stark terms. He stated that without tobacco, hundreds of thousands of men in the trenches would either go mad or become so nervously inefficient as to be useless. Many a badly wounded soldier died with a cigarette in his mouth, and the pain of death was less bitter because of that poison pill. The argument that tobacco could shorten life by 5 or 10 years or dull the brain seemed irrelevant in the trenches, where men stood in freezing blood and water, waiting for death. While the cigarette softened the monotony and trauma of trench life, it also left hundreds of thousands of men addicted to a harmful stimulant they didn't need in peacetime. When World War I finally ended, the U.S. Army sent home a new generation of smokers, now dependent on the cigarette. The Western world's markets quickly sensed an opportunity to sell more product. Benedict Crowell, the Assistant Director of War Munitions in the United States, estimated that 95% of all American soldiers used tobacco in one form or another during the war. Cigarette companies knew this and were eager to capture these potential customers the moment they returned home from service. In January 1919, just 2 months after the armistice, Chesterfield released a series of advertisements featuring soldiers from the Air Force, Navy, and Army, all smoking Chesterfield cigarettes. These ads linked cigarettes directly to soldiers, portraying smoking as an act of patriotism. What was once considered a vice linked to the ills and immorality of America was now associated with positive values like freedom, democracy, and modernity. As war had just popularized the cigarette. Equally important, the war disrupted the old perception of cigarettes as an effeminate vice meant primarily for boys or women. An 1884 New York Times article had described cigarettes this way. Before the war, pipes were seen as the most masculine way to consume tobacco, but now cigarettes had taken their place. By becoming the soldier's habit, the cigarette transformed into a symbol of American masculinity. And this wasn't limited to the United States. In March 1917, British tobacco manufacturer Woolworths released a set of 24 cards that were included with their cigarette packs. Each card depicted servicemen from various branches of the military and, at times, less famous roles supporting the war effort. This clever marketing move linked cigarettes with the bravery and sacrifice of the everyday person involved in the war, whether they were fighting on the front lines or working in the factories. Every puff of a Wills cigarette now carried patriotic significance. Particularly clever element of including cigarette cards, though Wills was not the first to do so, was that it encouraged smokers to buy more packs to collect all 24 cards. It gamified addiction. Despite these early tactics, cigarette advertising and the industry itself were still in their infancy. In many ways, World War I was just the beginning. In other words, the cigarette's rise was already well underway before World War II, driven by industrialization and increasing convenience and fashionability. Yet, while the Second World War wasn't the sole driver, it certainly accelerated the trend. In World War I, a total of 7.5 billion cigarettes were shipped for military use. In World War II, that number skyrocketed to 92 billion per year. The average American soldier consumed so many cigarettes that by December 1944, a defense report noted that 30% of the total supply of cigarettes was going to the armed forces overseas, combined with a surge in civilian demand, created a cigarette shortage, leading to hoarding and panic buying. The American cigarette industry ramped up production, pumping out more cigarettes than ever before. Annual output jumped from 172.5 billion in 1939 to 267.6 billion in 1945, an increase of 55% in just 6 years, more than during the First World War. Cigarette marketing became intertwined with wartime patriotism and sacrifice. Advertisements encouraged people to buy cigarettes and war bonds, framing both as equally patriotic acts. Marketing campaigns even started targeting women who had been drafted in large numbers into the war effort. One ad in the November 1944 edition of Vogue featured 4 women in different wartime jobs, all praising Camel cigarettes as their favorite smoke. The slogan was clear: with so many women in the war, as with so many men, their cigarette is Camel. Cigarette manufacturers also encouraged women to buy cigarettes as gifts for their husbands or boyfriends in the military, as if the free cigarettes included in soldiers' rations weren't enough. 2 of the largest brands, Camel and Chesterfield, launched advertisements promoting their cigarettes as ideal gifts for servicemen, each trying to convince female buyers that their product was the most cherished smoke in the service. They even encouraged sending cartons overseas as gifts. Another war-related marketing tactic came from Lucky Strike, which claimed to have changed its packaging colors, removing green and red and replacing them with red and white, because the green allegedly contained copper, a metal needed for war production. Lucky Strike spun this shift as an act of patriotic sacrifice with the slogan, "Lucky Strike Green has gone to war." However, the green in their branding actually contained chromium, not copper, and the company had been planning to change its unpopular color scheme regardless of the war. The US joining the conflict gave them the perfect opportunity to link their product to patriotism and the armed forces. To strengthen this connection, Lucky Strike included the phrase "Lucky Strike" means fine tobacco in its advertisements, designed in a style reminiscent of Morse code. This aggressive marketing wasn't universal, though. In Germany, cigarette advertising was restricted. The Nazi Party actively promoted anti-smoking rhetoric, banning public smoking in several places in the name of public hygiene and social purity. Despite this stance, cigarettes were still deemed a war-important product under the Nazi regime. Much like in the US during World War I, moral and health concerns were sidelined in favor of cigarettes' ability to boost soldiers' morale. In 1941, Joseph Goebbels, the head of the Nazi propaganda ministry, blocked a campaign against smoking, noting that millions of soldiers were being provided cigarettes by the state for use on the front lines. However, despite these actions, the Nazi Party remained fundamentally opposed to smoking, which left a lasting legacy. Post-war, anti-smoking efforts were often associated with the authoritarianism of Nazi Germany, and public health campaigns against tobacco were labeled as fascistic by pro-tobacco activists. This likely contributed to a rise in cigarette consumption in Germany after the war. Elsewhere in Europe, cigarettes became even more commonplace. Under the Marshall Plan, a relief program aimed at bolstering capitalist democracies and curbing the spread of Soviet communism, 4.4% of all products shipped to Europe between 1948 and 1951 were tobacco-based. John W. Flanagan, a Virginia congressman and longtime tobacco industry advocate, argued that distributing cigarettes would help eliminate or retard the spread of ideologies antagonistic to democracy and world peace. This arrangement provided a significant boost to the U.S. tobacco industry, which had overproduced and now found itself with surplus stock. The U.S. government stepped in, buying the excess supply and shipping it to Europe, hoping that luxury goods like tobacco would help lift post-war austerity and jumpstart the European economy. However, this flooding of American tobacco had adverse effects. Domestic tobacco production in countries like Greece was undercut by the cheaper, subsidized U.S. product. threatening one of Greece's core industries. When Greece protested, the Economic Cooperation Administration (ECA), tasked with implementing the Marshall Plan, cited pressure from the southern U.S. tobacco lobby and refused to accommodate the Greek government's concerns. Furthermore, many European governments became reliant on cigarette taxes as a major revenue source, helping to solidify the post-war culture of smoking. From 1945 to the late 1980s, cigarettes accounted for roughly 80% of global tobacco consumption. While smoking rates have declined in the U.S. since then, Europe remains deeply entrenched in its cigarette habit. It's difficult to say what cigarette consumption would have looked like without the massive influence of the two world wars, but it's clear that the conflicts significantly boosted its popularity. Militaries worldwide, from Japan to the US, Britain to Germany, included cigarettes as part of soldiers' basic rations. Armies became incubators for the smoking habit, addicting generations of soldiers who, after the war, returned home and introduced their friends and families to cigarettes. This spread of smoking was aided by advertising campaigns that exploited the association between cigarettes and patriotism. After all, how could cigarettes be harmful if they had helped soldiers fight against the forces of evil? Smoking during wartime became an act of solidarity, a way to bond in difficult times. This culture carried over into peacetime, where smoking became a social marker, a way to fit in. World War II had additional unexpected consequences for Europe. The U.S. intentionally reinforced the cigarette habit through the Marshall Plan, and Germany's defeat led to a rejection of anything associated with fascism, including the Nazis' anti-smoking stance. As a result, opposition to smoking was stigmatized as authoritarian, helping the habit to spread unchallenged in post-war Germany. Finally, both world wars contributed to a more globalized and interconnected world, opening up new markets and facilitating an international cigarette trade that spread the habit and its health risks across continents. The cigarette burned brightest in the twilight of war, and though its flame has dimmed in some places, it still burns today, dragging many smokers to an early grave.